Now back in our routes file, at the top of our user routes, we have Router.param user ID. So what is this? For every other route, it looks like we have a bunch of route methods corresponding to their HTTP method that's being used, like get, put, post, delete. But what is this Router.param? Well, Router.param is a kind of convenience method. For every route that you see that has this :user ID that uses a route param, and if the route param matches user ID, we can execute the handler for this in order to get a user by ID. So we're going to need to get a user by their ID a lot to get their data according to the user's ID. So instead of having to chain it before every request that we make, or do it within the specific handler function, we'll just do it with the help of Router.param. So we'll go to get user by ID in our user controller. And again, we can think of get user by ID as a kind of middleware function. We're going to take the ID that we're given from the route, from the end of the route, use that to find a user, and we'll also check to see if that user's data that we're getting is same as the data for the session that we have for the currently authenticated user. So first of all, get user by ID will be async. We'll have request response next, and then we'll also have this special ID parameter with Router.param. So we are able to easily get the user ID value from the route and pass it as this last argument. So we can say await user.find1. We want to find one user as compared to the find where we're finding a list or an array. So we'll find one, and we need to pass in a filter here. We want to find a user by their underscore ID. So underscore ID is the property, and the value we get as just plain ID. So if we have a user, we'll assign the return value to user, and in any event we're going to put that user data on the request on a profile property. So if we find a plain user, we put it on request.profile, but it's a special case if the ID that we have is equal to the ID of the currently authenticated user. So in order to compare the ID of the user that we find with the user that's on request.user, that's put there by passport, we can do a comparison with the help of mongoose. So we can say mongoose.types.objectID. So if we have an object ID, and remember an object ID is this special underscore ID value, which is different than a normal ID since we can use it to do operations like populate that normal IDs aren't capable of. We can say mongoose.types.objectID and take the ID, the underscore ID value that's put on the request and on the profile property, and set that equal to profile ID. We need this object ID method in order to compare our two object IDs, both from the user that we find as well as from the user in the session. So we can say if profile ID dot equals, it exposes this equals method, request.user.underscore ID, so our currently authenticated user, we can put on the request this is auth user flag set to true. And from here we can return next. Otherwise, if we just have any user that's not the same as the one that's authenticated, we'll skip over this conditional and just return next without setting is auth user to anything. So for example, get user by ID is especially important if we're doing something that's of great significance like deleting our account. So if we look at our routes again, and we take a look at this router.route, and we can use router.route to chain on a lot of different requests onto the same exact path. So for /API/users/user ID, we can delete a given user's account, first by using checkauth to make sure that we're authenticated, but we're also using the user ID param, and this is where this isAuthUser flag is important. So let's just jump ahead and create delete user. If we wanted to delete a user, we need a request and a response. and this will be async. Here we just need to grab the user ID from the parameters that we're sending through, so we can say request.params, grab the user ID property off of it, and we'd use the find one and delete method from user. So to ID, for our filter, we'd pass user ID, and we can return the deleted user. And we can return it as JSON. But what's important here is that we don't have any check to make sure that the user that's signed in, that request.user, that it's the same as the user's account that's trying to be deleted. So all we'd need to do here to make sure only the authenticated user can delete their account, and say if not request.isAuthUser, we're going to return a status code 400 with the message, you are not authorized to perform this action. So if, for example, I'll just save, we head back to Postman and we grab John's ID, but we sign in with a different person, so we'll make a post request to /API/auth/signup, and we'll just include a name again. Name will be, say, Jane at gmail.com, and Jane. So we sign up, and we make sure to add all the necessary commas. We sign up, we get back our username, we need to sign in. We just do that with email and password. And now that we're signed in, we try to go to /API/users, post in John's ID, use a delete method, and remove our request body. What will happen? We should get our error message saying you're not authorized to perform this action. And this is because of our isAuthUser flag. However, if we request an array of all of our users again, take Jane's ID, and try to delete her account, we hit send, we get returned all of the deleted data. And if we run /API/users again, we only see John. So in fact, that Jane user was removed.